So they invited me to be the vice president of brand design and gave me about 400 designers. The biggest team I'd ever had was 35, and I actually didn't even manage them because they kind of just managed themselves. And so one of the most challenging things that I ever do was try to scale to understand how design could work in what was already a pretty vibrant and structured corporate culture. And the punchline is I sort of failed. But fast forward, and I'll tell you one more story that I think where I think design did quite well. I was part of a company called Macromedia. They created Flash, and had a blast. It was a company that was very, very design focused, had a lot of really strong entrepreneurial energy. It was just everything about the job was great. But we got bought by our competitors, a company that we loathed, Adobe, corporate, mean-spirited. They weren't actually mean-spirited, but we thought they were. So suddenly I had to take my design culture and bring it to a different culture. There were some key differences. First of all, I had about 20 designers. They had about 130. Their designers were set up in like a production studio. So a product manager or an engineer would order some assets and they would produce the assets. Sometimes they'd let them solve a few pedestrian problems, but it wasn't the way design, it's not what I understood design was, because I thought design was at the heart of what a product is or what a product could be, or at the heart of the relationship you create with your customer, not like a copier. Right? It was terrible. So I had to go through that culture clash, and it was a really interesting challenge. The outcome actually was, and it took a number of years, was not only pivoting the internal design culture, but getting Adobe to once again appreciate their core audience, the creative. And we created this thing called the Creative Cloud, which really was incubated in our design organization and completely changed the company. It was definitely the biggest business success I've ever been involved with. But it didn't happen. It certainly didn't happen easily, and it took a long time.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Talking about the recent challenges with Uber, and I guess the issues with the cities with overpopulation, congestion, traffic jams. How do you see the Uber mission to transform the cities in something more sustainable?
Oh, no, we're not doing that. We're making it a lot worse. We have a long-term vision of how basically creating a platform for transportation is going to transform cities. Any of you that have spent any time doing urban design or architecture probably know that there are only a few factors that decide the shape of a city. And economics is one of them, which we're pretty heavily involved with. Transportation is another. There are a few others, legislation, social patterns, and things like that, but transportation is really, really critical. And there are obviously cities where transportation is at a breaking point. And in the short term, we have made it worse. We have increased the number of cars. But we've also increased mobility. I have a story I like to tell, which is a bit of a tangent, but since I'm the one here and my picture's up there, I get to tell it. Picture, if you will, the Paris metro map. So that beautiful spider web of transportation that covers pretty much all of Paris. It's pretty remarkable, although it's really easy to get lost. If those are a series of lines spidering out from the city center, you're going to notice that there's holes. There's black spots where transportation doesn't go. There's almost a perfect correspondence between those empty spots in the Paris metro area and low income. So it's pretty easy to infer, I don't know the causal relationships, which came first, but that a lack of access to transportation creates a lack of access to opportunity. And as a result, you don't do as well economically. Now overlay the Uber map, basically 24 hours of Uber drivers crisscrossing the city. And you'll see they cross back and forth over those black areas all the time. And so automatically you can say, well, now they have more access, which should lift at least the possibilities for people in those areas. But more importantly, and this is the punchline, I guess, is if you take the very first ride and you put the location of where they start with their very first ride, it's often in those black spots. So that's where our supply of drivers, we're not allowed to know where a driver lives, but it appears that our supply of drivers are coming primarily from those areas. So we are an opportunity engine, both in the way we help people get access and in that getting them that first job, that first rung on the ladder. So I get really excited about that. And then one more shape of city stories. I live in the Mission. Does anybody here live in San Francisco? Spend any time in the Mission? Good place. The Mission just passed an ordinance where they're going to stop the building of bars and restaurants because there's just too many. And for those of you that know San Francisco well, the Mission District used to have a high concentration of activity on 18th and 24th, where the BART stations are, because that's where people get on, that's where you get off, that's where you want your restaurant or your bar. Just come right in there, or your Walgreens. And so what's happened now is there's a continuous line of Uber and Lyft cars up Mission, down Valencia, and all of the restaurant owners know they can put it anywhere. They can put their restaurant or their bar anywhere, and Lyft will just get you there, or Uber will just get you there. And so as a result, there is an economic distribution that's changing the shape of the city. And it's subtle right now, but it's going to be more profound over time. I could talk about this for the rest of the evening if you want.
Interesting. Did you foresee this kind of effect, and how do you approach with testing and verification?
Oh yeah, everything that Uber's done was completely intended from day one. We knew that we were going to transform cities for the better. We were going to give millions of people jobs. All of it. No, none of it. There's a talk that I like to give, and I start with why I joined Uber, which has more to do with a divorce than any interest in Uber itself. In fact, my first Uber ride was to interview. But I'd been there for a few months, and I saw these patterns developing, which is throughout the world, Uber was doing some really remarkably good things. There were all the bad things you heard about in 2017, and a lot of those were true, actually all of them. And so Uber could be, a force for bad as well. But there were these profoundly good things that were happening, and they appeared to have happened completely by accident. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in developing our design practice is to figure out how to anticipate these consequences and develop solutions that are optimized for social good, for environmental good, and especially for economic good.
And do you have kind of simulation, artificial intelligence? How does it work to simulate such a megapolis?
Well, so we simulate everything. Underneath everything we do is a pretty complicated logistics engine. Mm-hmm. That basically we can run simulations against it anytime we want, but we're also feeding in the real data. Mm-hmm. There's all these people who speak this really, really strange language and write algorithms on walls and stuff I don't understand at all. But so that's one. And then there's another one on top of that, which is a marketplace engine. And so we're constantly developing more sophisticated marketplace analytics and structures. When you put those two things together, you can run all sorts of simulations. You can make all kinds of assumptions. You can also get it horribly, tragically wrong. And if you want, I'll tell you one of those stories. But absolutely, yeah. We all love to go there. But as we get more and more data, we can provide more and more inputs and learn more and more about what's possible. The challenge is all those places where no amount of data and no amount of simulation is going to help. And I'll give you one quick example, and then I'll tell you about a place where we got it wrong. There are very, very complex social dynamics playing out all over the world where people are connecting across cultures, across races, across economic divides, people who don't normally connect. It's a very minor version of it in an area like the Bay Area where you were taught don't get in a stranger's car. Now, of course, we all get in a stranger's car every day. Somehow the app's supposed to make the stranger less strange, but we still do it. And so as these social dynamics are playing out, there are a lot of unintended consequences. Some of those unintended consequences are things like people dying. And there doesn't appear to be any amount of simulation we're going to do to figure out when those kinds of things are going to happen. It plays out. We try to figure out new ways of creating safer experiences, mostly safeguards, mostly things that mitigate. I'm really, really curious about things that are proactive. Like, let's say you and I were going to meet to do this talk, which we did. One way to do it was for me to just walk right in here and go, hey, I'm ready to talk. And you'd say, well, who the hell are you? Or whether or not instead you have a dialogue, and that dialogue grows over time, trust gets built. And so I would like to look at systems that help build more trust. We have ratings, that's all we have right now. I'd also love to look at little interventions in the physical environment that change the way you think about it. Like, it's we'll role play. I'm the rider, you're the driver, it's your car. Your first thought is, why the hell am I letting this slob in my car? Because it's my car. And why is he talking on his phone? And my first thought is, you're just my driver, right? I can do whatever I want. I'm paying you. Well, neither one of those are exactly true. It's more complicated than that. You're an independent person who's chosen to use your private vehicle to make some money. I'm a person that's agreed to, in fact, sought out to work with you instead of work with some other commercial vendor. And so we have to think about our relationship differently. And I think Uber can play a role in that. Okay, so now unintended consequences. If you're a driver, you get this thing, it's like a power-up. It's a little chip. And what you get to do with it is use it to go wherever you want. And you'll find that this is super useful if you're a driver in Sacramento, which turns out to be very common, but you're making your money in San Francisco. You'd like your ride at the start of the day to be someplace like Travis or something, to get you one good ride into the city. And you'd like your last ride of the day to get you as far back towards Sacramento as you can. And so it was a popular program. We were trying to figure out how to improve our relationship with drivers after some of the challenges of 2017. So at the end of 2017, start of 2018, we did the 100 days of drivers. We added more and more programs, incentives, and things like that. We tried to listen really, really hard to what drivers were saying. We tried to include them in the design process. But one of the things we did is we realized they really like these little tokens. So somebody got the brilliant idea, well, if 2 is good, wouldn't 6 or 8 be awesome? So we launched it. Within 48 hours, every driver was down by the airport. San Francisco was friggin' empty, right? Because we hadn't really thought through the consequences of letting every driver do whatever the hell they wanted. It doesn't actually work. Basically, we had simulated it based on the percentage of drivers who use tokens and what they use them for, which was going home or going to work. Instead, they all used it to go try to get better rides at the airport, which, by the way, are much more profitable rides, but not for the drivers. There's a really interesting psychology that goes on where if you think, well, this was a $30 ride, then you're making more than, 3 $10 rides. But it turns out if you look at the time that you have to wait to get an airport ride, the economics don't work out. So I don't know how I got on that subject. No. This whole evening can go like this.
We have a broader audience who wants to hear.
Just stick this in my ear.
Yeah, so the audience online could hear you.
Okay, audience online.
Sorry, thank you.
So, talking about the personas and foresee the social impact, I guess you have like personas, but how you can find the trade-off between 2 generic personas, like driver and passenger, and like too narrow when you have a particular age and demography specification?
We should have brought my head of research. So she has a team of like 95 people who obsesses over the people that we serve. And the personas, if you want to call them personas, are very, very specific. We're also a global company. The needs of a driver in India are pretty radically different than a driver in the Bay Area. And across the customer base that they serve, no two writers are really, really alike. We have to design for pretty generic cases. We have to do general problem solving. But we do try to understand what make different kind of people tick. And that's their specialty. The reason that I'm being kind of general about this is I friggin' hate personas. So the term persona, the way personas are pursued, this idea that there is some idealized customer, and if you just create the right fit for them, design for them, the angels come out, like little sparkly things happen. It just turns out to not usually be true. You can do as much damage by over-indexing on a personality type or a demographic or something like that as you can do good. Thinking about your customers constantly there's nothing more valuable. Connecting with your customers constantly, there's nothing more valuable. Being the customer, like we all drive, we have to, we all ride, we all eat. Little plug for the Eats business. So we try really, really hard to be the customer. And I think that understanding is often more valuable than just a persona on the part. But I will tell you, there were personas when I was at Nike. They had, I'm going to get the number wrong, it was 100 and something. And every single persona had a cardboard cutout that was out on the campus. And some of those were super, super useful because it turns out I don't know anything about an inner city baller. In fact, I'd never heard the term baller before I got to Nike. But there was a picture of him, and it turns out that you can just walk by it every day and read a little bit about him. And so that they're indexing on specific cultural types or social types on purpose because they're trying to amplify them. I think we're doing the opposite. Right? We're not trying to come up with a radically different service for radically different personality types. We're trying to generalize. That was a pretty good answer.
Yeah. I have a question. You mentioned that you rely on the data to make a forecast and foresee what's going to be effect of the changes that you're making in the system. But you also mentioned in some of your talk about love of the product and making irrational decisions. So how you combine this all together?
Well, so my passion is on the irrational side. At least I like to say it that way.
It's another year.
This year? Thank you. Becca. I tell people to trust their instincts. And I think most of us don't. We can get so paralyzed or so, influenced by rigorous, logical, organized, data-driven decisions that we lose common sense. And we lose the most powerful engine we have. Because if you work on one of these problems for any significant amount of time, your brain knows more than you do about how to solve those problems. I mean, it's kind of ironic. So they teach us a lot in design. This idea that you're constantly trying to force a decision and that the answer is already there. You just aren't apprehending it. You're putting so much in front of your subconscious's ability to already know what the answer is. Some of these people that seem like savants, they just have more open channels. They're not as smart as anybody. They're probably doing less analysis. But oh my God, our brains are so good at absorbing huge, huge amounts of information from sources we don't even know about, synthesizing them, and then coming back with insights. And so you want to strike that balance. You don't ever want the data, the logic, the linear path to get in the way of every once in a while just being arbitrarily brilliant.
Yeah. Thinking about the gap between companies, there's digital native and have ability to, first of all, understand data, build a decision, and platform on data, and be open-minded to listen and love customer. And the classical enterprises, those are not digital native. How do you see the market and evolution in this space? Whether they have a chance to survive, what they need to do to bridge the gap and make it become more customer oriented.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to pretend to be very knowledgeable about this. We have seen company after company that didn't start digitally. Well, I was with, how was that? Somebody I was hanging out with last night was a very, very senior person at Sears and was there basically for their entire collapse. He was responsible for, I think, the whole digital side of their business. Like, what can we do to save our asses? Because we're going downhill fast, and this just isn't working. And it is hard to make those transitions. But I think it has less to do with digital, and it has more to be about being an incumbent and overly dependent on whatever you're currently doing. We're at the point right now where second or third stage digital companies are just as calcified and just as stuck in their old ways. I mean, I want to tell you stories about Microsoft. Probably get me in trouble, but that's a company that is founded on a bunch of principles and has operating models that are not very effective anymore. But they're going to hold on to those old ways as long as they possibly can, maybe even a little bit longer. Mm-hmm. So I think it's less about a divide between digital and non-digital, and it has more to do with being victims of your own success, or not being your corporate culture, your corporate mind is impliable.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible to bring this culture and innovation through the injection outside? Like, there are a lot of design boutiques who work on the creation of new products and serves various companies. Is it possible to change the culture outside?
So outside design firms have had a really, really interesting history, like over the last 15 or 20 years. Consultancies started as the only ones that knew the craft. Like, it was pretty easy to, I had a firm called Construct, and we were the only ones that knew how to use these tools. We were the only ones that knew how to build these digital models. We were the only ones that knew how to draw. And so jobs were easy to get because there were no internal design teams. Over time, they became more and more dependent on these outside vendors. That's not comfortable to a business, so internal teams scaled. When the internal teams first scaled, some of them were more strategic, some of them were more tactical, and so the companies like IDEO would sneak in where you were less strategic, and there were plenty of other design firms that would go in and be getting their hands dirty, or more tactical. The latest wave of design firms, I don't know what they're targeting or what they're focusing on. It's pretty hard to figure out how to engage with them and what they stand for, because there is so much focus on the internal team. Mm-hmm. So I think we're at one of those stages where those kinds of design organizations are trying to figure out what they're going to stand for next, where they're going to provide the most value. Some of them go after other aspects of the business that the core design teams usually don't understand. So companies that use design thinking to focus on business problems, mm-hmm. Or companies that are better at creating connections in the parts of the organization that don't currently have design focus. That seems to be one of the trends. But you can buy it, sort of. But like most things that you rent, you don't end up owning them. Because now this is probably the big message, and after this I'm just going to leave. Design's not the sole responsibility of designers. They're okay at it. They can facilitate certain of the practices we associate with design. But design has to become an ethos of the whole company. And yeah, it has to be highly participatory. It has to be highly multidisciplinary, or it's just not that effective.
Yeah. I saw a couple of cases, like based on my experience when working in an engineering company. I saw that sometimes you can bring the design thinking and product design capabilities, but there is an engineering team that is two-way disconnected sometimes.
Yes.
And this is cultural growth because they doing the development and should think about the customer and the value they are bringing, not just create the requirements. So how to bridge this gap? Is it possible to teach engineers about design thinking and love the customer?
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of it depends on the organization. I think that I told you about my past experience. When I was at Macromedia, there were very few designers because every single engineer cared about the quality of the end user experience that was generated by the code. Now, it's a very, very specific kind of set of tools, creative tools. So it's kind of not a slam dunk, but like if you're working on coming up with a new digital tool, you care deeply about how that tool is going to affect creatives in the creative process. It's not just abstract code, and it's easy for people in very, very large organizations where a ton of this stuff is on the back end to not see they were clear to the end experience. It's also really interesting, a phenomenon I've seen in a few different companies. I won't name any, Uber, where the interface coding of interfaces is considered like a second-rate skill. It's not the primary skill. The really hot people are doing the algorithms. Really hot people are doing hard load balancing problems, and it's sort of pedestrian, to work on the user experience. And I don't think our user experience is very well coded. It's not well structured. We don't use frameworks very well. We don't use components very well. It's just not prized. And so I know it's possible. We haven't done it yet. So we're working on it.
Talking about the future of design, how do you see where the design is going toward? There are multiple technology, and there's a kind of merge between AR, VR. It's a completely new field. There is a product with AI, and I guess there is something different techniques we need to apply to create these products around it.
Well, so before I talk about the techniques, I think the future of design is to have a greater and greater impact. That when I first got into these fields, I used to talk about useful, usable, desirable. And I remember we were kind of going from the useful to the usable stage. So usability was a huge thing. The Jacob Normans of the world were talking about how to make this thing like just so you could. It didn't just solve the task. It solved the task the way that you understood and you could manage. Desirable, like it was thought of as only the purview of very mature products. So you can see where the audio industry started to just get you from point A to point B. And then at some point it was going to get you to point A to point B without killing you. And then finally it was going to get you to point A to point B and make you feel really good about yourself and give you social status and connect you to the world and maybe help, make you self-actualized or at least play really good music. That scale is being collapsed in most companies right now. There's almost, for most technologies, there's almost an immediate need for that technology to be meaningful, not just solve a core problem. If you're only focused on functional needs and you're not focused on emotional needs, it's very, very hard to win. So that's the future, is that we'll do that for everything all the time. Everything will be designed. And that doesn't mean designers, but everything will be designed. So that's the big future. In terms of techniques, we're in an awkward place right now. Design tools have gotten less flexible, more rigid. Teams have gotten larger, so we're struggling with how to be more collaborative. It used to be, you could just start talking and the entire design organization would know what you were saying. It's just not like that anymore.